Hi, everyone. I have an announcement to make, but before I do, I just wanted to take a minute and thank all of my listeners and my incredible guests that have shared space and time and stories with me over this last 2.5 years. I am so grateful. And I am transitioning this podcast into a live show with a co host. She's been my spiritual teacher and dear friend. Her name is Valerie, and we have our mission and vision in the show notes, so please check that out. The show is going to launch on Wednesday, February 7th at noon. It will be on all of my social media sites, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. All of those links are also in my show notes. If you're not able to make the live show, we will also be recording it, and it will show up just the way my podcast has shown up for you. It's going to be, as I said, available on all of those different social media sites. And I am super excited and I hope to see you there. So thank you so much. Just thank you. Thank you for all of your continued support. And I hope that we can continue to put out content that helps all of you and encourages you to rock your shine. So thank you, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Rock Your Shine After You've Been Cracked Wide Open. I am so excited about my guest today, and her name is Dr. Dawn DiRaimondo. She is a clinical psychologist and lives in Sacramento, California, where she lives with her husband and her two children. Dr. Dawn lost her 22-year-old brother Michael in 2004 while he was serving as an Army flight medic in Iraq. This significantly impacted her both personally and professionally. She went on to specialize in grief and loss in her private practice. After learning from a client in 2019 that few resources were available for sibling loss, she began writing. Surviving Sibling Loss, The Invisible Thread That Connects Us Through Life and Death was published in 2020. And I'm just going to say on the side, I have read this book or listened to it on tape, and it's fabulous. I highly recommend it. Along with sharing her own story, 14 others that lost siblings were interviewed, and their insights were included as well. Surviving Sibling Loss can be found on Amazon, Audible, Kindle, and more. And we will also have that link in the show notes. So, Dawn, I just want to welcome you to the show. I'm very excited about this connection.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's been so nice to meet you and get to know you and to be here today. So thank you.
And just so everybody knows, the two of us are going to be keynotes together of a sibling loss summit that we are in the midst of putting together that's coming out in April. So more on that. We will be letting you all know when tickets go on sale. So let's start with your story. Tell us about your brother.
Wow. So let's see. I am the oldest of three children. My brother was the youngest and only boy. So it's me, my sister, and my brother. And he's 6.5 years younger than me. So we are a close Italian family. And he decided that he was going to join the Army when I think he was about 21 at the time. My father and grandfather were also in the Army. So it's a little bit of a family legacy. And unfortunately, he didn't come home. He went to Iraq as a flight medic. He loved what he did, and he worked really hard to get to the position he was in and on a helicopter. And he was there for almost a year, and he was 6 weeks away from coming home. And unfortunately, his helicopter was shot down, and they were not able to save any of the 9 people on board. And so in 2004, I was 28 years old. He was 22. And it just, it sort of set a bomb off in our family and sort of thrust into this world of grief and loss. And it felt shattering. I sort of had to figure out how to put my life, it felt like, back together, my family's life back together. I had just recently become licensed as a psychologist. And so it actually changed how I worked a bit. I was working in an agency at the time. I left that to do a private practice instead. And I basically had to learn how to survive losing a sibling. And that's what my life became. Learning how to live without my brother Michael being with us, and to still somehow integrate him into our family. And that's what basically the rest of my life and career have been.
Yeah, and I want to, because I know that another area that you specialize in and have talked about is what it's like to lose a sibling in those young adult years, right? We have
Mhm.
information when when children lose a sibling and how things can kind of fall apart inside of a house. And then I have written about, what it is like to be an older sibling where you kind of take everything over for your parents and you swallow back your grief. But here you are just getting on your feet. You're a young
Right.
adult. You're not married at the time, right? I think that you
Right.
were dating. You're a tight Italian Catholic fan. I said a Catholic. I don't know if you were Catholic, were
I was
you?
raised Catholic. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Italian Catholic too. That's why I just said that because we were very
Right.
tight. But I think that what would be interesting to hear from you because you were all so young and
Mhm.
just getting your own independent life off the
Right.
ground. What was that? You weren't living at home at that
Right.
point, right? You were living on your own. Tell me what was going on for you after this life-shattering thing happened. What role did you play? What happened with you, with your parents?
Mhm.
How did you navigate that early grief in your life?
That, that's a great question. It's really hard at that age because in your 20s, your friends don't relate, your partner doesn't, nobody can really relate to significant loss. I didn't know anybody else who had lost a sibling besides my sister. And so I feel like people didn't really know how, I guess, to best support me. They didn't know what to do. And I was so focused on helping my mom, my parents. And so much of my attention and time was on helping them. And actually, they were in Southern California. I was living in Northern California. And I think I went home like every 3 weeks for that first year. And so much of my focus was on trying to help my mom. And what happened to me is very common, which happens to a lot of siblings, is you get lost in that. Nobody realizes how much you're grieving because the focus is so much on your parents. Your own focus is on your parents a lot of times. And that was definitely the case for me. And nobody really knew how I was feeling. And I probably look like I feel better than I do. Like I'm one of those people that I'll say presents well, right? So even with clients, sometimes they'll present like they feel a lot better than they actually do. And then people don't actually really know what's going on the inside and don't know you need more support than it appears. I put myself in a therapy. That was huge for me, being in therapy and to be able to talk about all of it, right? And how to navigate all of it because I couldn't share all of it with my parents. I couldn't share it with my friends. I couldn't share it with my then boyfriend who became my husband. Although I did say to him, I need you to ask me how I'm feeling. And then I'm going to say fine or something. And then I need you to ask me how I'm really feeling so that we both know that means, how are you doing about your brother? Because I needed him to know. And I wasn't, I guess, good at just asking for help or support. And so he thought I was doing okay. I mean, I think everybody thought I was doing okay. And so I specifically had to ask him to do that.
And I want to state the obvious here because you and I are both therapists, and I think as therapists, I think lots of things happen with that, right? It's an energy where, we sort of play that natural role, right? Being a support to other people in our world. I mean, it's
Right.
it's our vocation. And here
Right.
you were a young therapist, right? You just finished your
Yep.
doctoral program.
Right.
And so there was probably, I'm guessing, at that young age that, you are just starting out on your career, and there's always that anxiety, that feeling of, do I know what I'm doing? Am I going to do a good job? This huge trauma happens in your family, and now you are the therapist in the family, right? And
Right.
jumping into that role and reaching out for help because I do know it's sort of like the shoemaker's children have no shoes, right? That we're always sort of the last ones to reach out for that help. And so I also went to a therapist, but I was much older than you were when
Mm.
I lost my brother. And so I would be interested to know something that you were saying is I couldn't go to my friends, I couldn't go to my boyfriend. What do you mean you couldn't? Did you
Well,
feel like
that's,
they tell me
yeah.
what you mean by that?
I don't know if it's fair to say I couldn't because, I had great friends. They're still in my life. They're lifelong friends. They wanted to support me and they would say, I'm here for you. But it's hard to know what to do. Like, do you just bring them up or say, I'm just feeling really sad? I think for me, I felt tired a lot. Like for me, grief felt not so much that I was crying with my friends as much as I was irritable. I didn't have a lot of patience. I felt like I wasn't this sort of sweet person I remembered being. I became more jaded. I became exhausted. I more short tempered. Like I hardly even recognized myself. And so I feel like I didn't even know what to do. And I think a lot of people probably relate to that. And what's hard is what one person wants maybe is for people to directly ask, how are you doing? Or how are you feeling about your brother? Or what's it been like for you? Other people maybe don't want you to ask them those things that they want to, if they want to bring it up, they'll bring it up, but they don't want people asking. So I think what's hard with grief is it's not, there's one size fits all. Like it really depends on the person. So that felt kind of tricky. And I do think if someone hasn't gone through significant loss, they just really have no idea. They've really no idea. They're like, it's been 3 months or it's been 6 months. You're still sad about that. Like they don't understand what you go through. And I'm guessing that if you lose someone in your 40s or 50s or 60s, your friends have all gone through more loss. Unfortunately, at those ages, I think it's more common, but not so much in your 20s.
No,
It's not as common.
and that's why I'm asking because even I think a common theme in grief is feeling like we can't get what we need from our friends and family. I don't actually care how old we are. But I do agree with you that I think there's more to compare it to as we get older. We start losing parents and we
Right.
grandparents. And so we've been around loss, but I know even in my own situation, people move on after a couple of weeks, not because they
Right.
don't love us or don't care. It's
Right.
not, if they haven't been through it, it's very difficult to understand the way grief takes over the body, the
Right.
mind, right? Just it's all consuming. And I really appreciate the irritation because I think that where my irritation came in was I didn't have any energy to listen to normal conversation. It just didn't matter. It
Mhm.
seemed so
Mhm.
insignificant. It seemed
Mhm.
irrelevant. And
Mhm.
still I've never done well with chit chat. It's not who
Mhm.
I am in general. But after my brother died, it became more so. I craved a deeper connection with people who could understand
Right.
what grief is, this nameless thing that completely inhabits your body and your life in this way that you can't, like you said, you become unrecognizable. So, what was happening for you? Because it's also very isolating, right?
Mhm.
Where you don't really feel like you can't get what you need from the people around you because you don't know what that is. You just know whatever you're getting isn't working, right?
Mhm.
It's not satisfying that deep ache. So you spent a lot of time, you were working, right? You didn't, did you take a leave from work or did you just
Like
dive right
two
in?
weeks, like that, not very much, just a couple weeks.
What was it like for you to be dealing with this huge thing in your life and also in your professional life, you were supporting people with their own mental health issues. What was it like to hold those two things at the same time?
That's a really good question. It's been so long now. It's been like 20 years, which is
Hard to
so hard to
believe. Yeah.
believe. My guess is I compartmentalized. I do remember that I did not talk about why I was gone. I didn't talk about, that I'd lost my brother. Like it felt way, way too vulnerable and raw. I do much more openly now with my clients, especially my grief and loss clients. I'll sort of explain where I come from, with doing grief work, but I couldn't in the beginning. And so, I focused more on depression and anxiety and parenting, or, I was seeing children and teenagers, and I think I would just join them and meet them where they were and be in that moment. And in some ways, it gave me a break. And actually, I talk about that you need breaks from grief because it's so exhausting. And so it would kind of give me a break, and I couldn't think about, how my parents were doing or what they needed, or worrying about my sister or myself, or frustrations that I felt like I had to just focus on who was right in front of me. And that was actually really helpful, maybe exhausting, but helpful. And I've always loved being a therapist. It's just a very natural role for me. And so I really liked having that outlet. And then I was given an opportunity to join a bit of a private practice. And so then I shifted, and then I really could work with almost whoever I wanted to. And I've always, in the beginning, especially worked with a lot of teenagers and young adults. And I love that age because they're so real and raw, and they're not old enough to have sort of a, false sense of self. They're kind of like, here I am, moody and miserable. And what are you going to do about it? And so that was actually helpful in some ways, I guess.
Yeah, because you talked about that you got therapy. How long after your brother died did you get yourself into therapy?
Shoot, I'd have to really I might have even been in therapy. My program required before you could graduate to do a year of your own therapy. And so, and then once you start therapy, you're like, oh, this is really nice
This
to
is
have someone listen to you,
great.
right? Where in our lives do we have undivided attention? Like, I'll say almost nowhere besides the therapy office,
I,
right?
I I agree with you. Yes.
Right. Even with our family and our friends, we're usually still, the phone is close by, except in the therapy office. Like, there's no phone. And so I don't remember if I was in therapy at the time or got myself into therapy, because therapy's been a part of my life. I always say the best therapists I know have done a lot of their own therapy, because you
100%.
don't know what you don't know. And if we're going to help people with personal growth, we better be doing the work ourselves.
100%.
So,
Yeah, I meet with someone weekly too. Like,
mhm,
I do my own work all the time. And
mhm,
it's and so and I had to do that too. I saw a specific, a grief therapist
mhm.
for a year after my brother died, because I think the thing that I talk, and I can't wait to hear your perspective on this, something I talk about my own clients with, because all of my clients come to me. I only take deep grief and loss. And what's interesting about grief work is, you said it before, how exhausting it is, and also how grief shows up in our life. I think that, I work with people who have delayed grief. I work, I've got someone who was 15 years old when he lost his mother, and he's, 38 now. That it is very patient. Grief is very, very patient,
Mhm.
and it waits for us,
Oh,
right?
it gives me the chills. I say
Yeah,
that all the time. Yeah.
yeah, it waits for us. And so I'm just interested in your own experience, both working with people and also with yourself. When somebody dies, it's sad. It's supposed to be, but it's the other things that come up as a result of that death that can really prolong our suffering. Talking to you, because this is in your book too, which I love so much, but give us some of the indicators when people really know it might be time to reach out for help. Because
Mhm.
I think grief is one of those things where it's tricky, right? Am I just sad over this death? How do I know when I really do need some extra support around this?
That's a great question. I guess, me as a therapist, like, if you lose a sibling, I'm going to tell anyone to probably go into therapy, because I think it's so helpful to process and put a voice to what you're experiencing, so that you have someone that's outside of your family, because sometimes family members can also trigger each other, right? Like, if you're grieving differently or whatnot, whereas a therapist gets to just help you with where you are, and they aren't personally involved in it. But I will say, let's say somebody doesn't do that initially. And when I have clients come in, it's often that they can't stop crying, and that it's been, let's say, months, and they feel stuck. They feel so like the grief has taken over everything, that it's hard for them to work. Some of them have to take a leave of absence from work or from school. They can't concentrate. They can't think. Everything is about the grief. And this might be a good time for me to bring up the car metaphor. Should I do that?
Please do.
Okay.
It's my
Um,
favorite metaphor.
I say that I've had to make up metaphors because there really aren't enough words to describe grief. Like, I really believe people in our society, or at least American culture, really they don't want to talk about grief that much. So we don't even have a vocabulary. So I use metaphors. And this came up in a session with a client because what I found is that when people first come into therapy, I tell people picture a car, a traditional car. You've got the front seat, passenger seat, back seat, like a trunk, kind of like the old school cars, I guess. And when people first come to therapy around grief, usually grief is in the driver's seat. It's taken over everything. It's present in every part of their life. And it's really kind of interfering with a lot of parts of their life, right? And their joyful, happy part of them is in the trunk. And they're pretty convinced that part's never coming back. Like it's in the trunk forever. But the reality is over time, as we talk a lot and they talk about their grief and they process it, and that could be with therapy. And I also want to mention that for people can be exercise and yoga and maybe being in a grief group, listening to podcasts, participating in activities. Maybe you do walks, right? So if you lost your sibling or your loved one to cancer or suicide, they have a lot of organized walks, right? So if we channel our grief energy, it kind of helps shift it, right? So in time, the grief sometimes goes to the passenger seat, right? People go back to work, they're able to sort of function at work, they're not crying all the time, but maybe they're crying on the way to work and home from work, but they're able to actually get back to work and grief has kind of moved over, right? And then eventually, as time goes on, you're going to get invited to weddings or graduations or birthdays, right? And then there's this dilemma of what do I do? I'm grieving. I don't want to celebrate, but I want to show up for these people I love and I care about. And I talk about, maybe that joyful part can get out of the trunk for a little while, get back in the car, even if it's just a couple hours while you go to this party, right? And your grief moves over, it's in the back seat, it's still there, you still feel it, hasn't gone away, but you're sharing other parts of yourself again, and they get to show up, right? And so your joyful part gets to come out. And what I found with my clients is they can get around that because they felt like if they acknowledged they were getting better, because in reality, that is kind of what was happening. They felt like they were betraying their loved one and they hated it. They didn't want to use the word better, maybe different, but they could get around that there's different parts of themselves and that the grief can move around the car. The grief is more fluid. It's more dynamic. It's not a moving on. It's not a forgetting. It's that the different parts of them show up in different places in the car and in their life. And that feels better to people.
Yeah, and the reason I love that metaphor and the movement, right? Just the whole metaphor of movement too, is that it really is moving, that over time we move from grief to mourning, right? And
Right.
that mourning is that true integration of, because I
Mhm.
think what I love about this is I think some of the most challenging things that my clients deal with that can be really tricky for them is when grief shows up as rage. And it can be all of these secondary things that bubble up as a result of the death. It can be rage toward, let's say we're talking about sibling loss here. It can be rage toward the spouse, right? There can be a lot of fallout, these secondary losses that can be so excruciating, and then our rage comes out, and that rage is just this rage over the the unfairness of it all, right?
Oh,
So
yeah.
even though we know that we're all going to die. Every single one of us know that. And we all want it to be in this beautiful chronological order. Our parents die in their 90s or when they're 100. And us as siblings, we're going to all grow old together. And even though we see those deaths around us, we don't actually really believe that it's going to happen to us. But the rage, right? And we know that rage and sadness are the same side of the same coin. But that rage can really wreak havoc in people's lives and
Mhm.
really hijack that they could potentially even feel like just that reprieve, right? We know we can hold joy and grief at the same time. And I love the trunk analogy because even if it pops its head out just every once in a while, we can have a relief from that deep grief. But it's the anger I have found in my own work. And I had anger too that I needed therapy for. I want you to talk a little bit about the anger. Did you personally ever go through any of the anger? And how can we fit that into this metaphor that you're using with the car, because I don't feel like we talk about rage enough when it comes to our grief process. I get that not everybody feels it, but plenty of people do. The way your brother died, murder, all of these different things that can happen.
It's a really interesting question. And I didn't get as angry as I would think I would have around the circumstances. Like people ask, was I angry about the war, that we shouldn't even be in Iraq? And I didn't. I don't know why. I think I felt like I knew he wanted to be there. Like he actually found himself through being a flight medic. He was like trying to figure himself out, and he finally did. And I guess I felt grateful he found what he loved to do, because I think that's such a gift. I guess my biggest fear is, that sounds crazy, but I was worried he'd get kidnapped. Like I believe in an afterlife. I believe he's safe where he is now. And that I was more afraid of, was if we didn't know what happened to him, or if he got kidnapped, or, you know, and I think I was so focused on surviving. I mean, I did feel like we were robbed of future, he never got to have children. And so like nieces and nephews or cousins, I felt really robbed of a future with him for sure. But I guess I wasn't as connected to anger the way maybe I should have been, because I was just trying to keep my head above water, and my parents, or my mother, like specifically trying to help her so much that it wasn't, or maybe some anger when I felt like people were more insensitive or didn't understand. I think I was more in touch with anger around that.
What about clients when you're working with them with their anger? What are some tips or some things that, and I'll chime in too, because I do think that anger is one of those things that it can be so debilitating, right? People, it's like it takes over. And I'm just curious, what what some what's
Yeah,
tools of how
I
you
know.
help
What are the
people.
tools? Oh my goodness. I can't help to think of different clients as you're asking me that have a really hard time with anger. They're stuck in it still. Or parents who lose children, they have so much guilt, as if they could have done something, when in every case they couldn't have done
They
anything.
couldn't have done anything right.
Right. And I guess like as a therapist, then we're like, we get to just create space for it, like talking about it, like talking about the anger and encouraging people to do that, or doing body work around anger, movement, exercise, EMDR, right? Different trauma modalities. Sometimes just talking isn't enough, actually. And I guess I want to say that too, that sometimes talk therapy, if people have been through a lot of trauma, can actually make something worse, and that there are different trauma modalities. People maybe have heard of EMDR, and there's a lot of research that it actually helps process trauma more efficiently. And I'm not trained in EMDR, so I've had to actually refer
Me too.
clients.
I've done the same thing. It's so
Yeah.
interesting that you say that when it's just too, it's they'll come to me after, right?
Hmm.
After they've done some of that deep trauma work because they're not even ready. They're not even ready to be able to be in therapy and to be able
Right.
to talk. It really is some deeper work. And I love what you're saying because there are so many different things out there that we know about, right? That actually energy work that,
Mhm.
Reiki. There's a whole bunch of different things out there that people can do. One of the other things I would add about anger is that it is so much energy that we can store up. It's almost like a pressure cooker, where you've got to have a release of some kind, whether that's a
Mhm.
physical release around
Mhm.
exercise, but it's understanding how if you are carrying anger. And I worked with a client whose sibling was murdered, and that is a
Mhm.
very difficult energy to work with because it feels so senseless, and so you get enraged by the
Mhm.
unfairness of it all and what has transpired and how long that that anger can hold you hostage,
Right.
truly. And that energy, then you start to become that experience of rage, the very thing that you're railing against, if that makes sense. I don't know if I'm
Mhm.
doing a good job articulating that. And so, and that focus, that more focus that we put in that area, the larger it grows. But here's the other piece, and this is what I want my listeners to hear, that the rage is also, I think, a belief that we can hold on to, that if I let go of my anger, what does that mean? Does that mean, that like I'm holding this anger of this thing that happened to my sibling that was murdered, and who will I be without that anger? Right? Because
And I would say, right, what I also see is that people are afraid if they're not angry or they're not grieving intensely, that they're going to lose their connection with their sibling.
that's where I was going exactly. If I let this go, what does this mean about my love for my sibling, my sister, my brother? So I'd
Right.
like you to go into that if you would.
Well, I acknowledge that and I normalize that with every client that I feel like we're bumping up against that they're holding on to it because they feel like that they have to hold on to their sibling or their loved one, depending on what the loss is. And then I remind them that integrating the loss in their life, the connection doesn't end. And in some cases, the connection can grow, that there's light at the other end of that. And there's connection. And I encourage them to even travel sometimes, like do the things that maybe they wanted to do with their loved one, didn't get to do together or did do, and they go back to it to remind them that their sibling and their loved one is always connected to them. They don't have to be angry. They don't have to be crying. They can even be in moments of peace. They'll still be able to connect to their siblings. And that's a super powerful experience. That was for myself too. Like I remember being afraid to go away. Like I went to Ireland. I remember I had a trip planned and I thought, I don't know if I could go away. Like he's never been there. I don't want to feel far away from him. Like you feel like you want to just cocoon in the beginning, right? Like you don't want to do anything. You just want to sort of cocoon. And I remember going and how empowering it felt to feel him there. Like that I was
Mm.
like, oh, I'm the connection. I can go anywhere and still feel connected to him. I don't have to be angry. I don't actually have to be devastated. I don't have to be frozen. Like he can always be connected to me. And so I guess I try and show clients in my practice that that can really happen. And eventually they sort of do things and they realize I did feel closer when I went and did this activity or whatnot that we would have done together. And it feels a little bit freeing because they learn how to integrate their sibling into their life. Right. And we talk about that a lot too. How do you still honor your sibling? What changes do you make? Like I've always said, I think one of the most powerful ways we can honor our sibling is to change because of our love and the loss of them in our lives. To be a better version of ourselves is a huge honor for them
I
because they
love it.
impacted us.
I love that. It's funny because my brother died on Valentine's Day, which always
Oh,
felt like such a crazy time when it's all about love and hearts, and mine and ours all broke. And what's been interesting is that since his death, the first couple of years that I dreaded Valentine's Day, and I turned Valentine's Day into this deep celebration of my brother and my love for him. I had my book published on Valentine's Day. I worked with my
oh,
publisher to push up that publishing date. The things I'm launching now, I'm launching right around Valentine's Day. So Valentine's Day for me has become this really special, special time to just do all the things to celebrate and honor his beautiful, magnificent life. And, I was talking to a client her son took his life.
mm,
And she said, I always dread this, this day. And so I was telling her about what I've done very intentionally around the death of my brother. And she said, I'm going to do that. I am going to start thinking about how I can make the anniversary of his death something to truly celebrate rather than something to dread. And I did that intentionally because I wanted that date to become a true a day that really is this wonderful moment for me to think about I mean, I think about him every day. I talk to my brother every day. I think I even told you that. Like he is, I believe in souls and the afterlife and the energy, and it's just a transitional time. And that's the other thing, that grief is such a dense energy that as that starts to dissipate over time and we bring that joy and levity, it actually is easier to connect
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
they vibrate at a much higher level than we do, right?
Right.
And so, and that joy can really be about that, I always say to Rocky, you're not here. And so I'm just going to go for it and live this life for the best, for the both of us, or
Mhm.
a playfulness, because he was
Mhm.
so playful and
Right.
he was very brave. And so the first year he died, he said, I'm going to try something new every single month in
Right.
honor of my brother. Right. So, all of these different ways that we
Mhm.
can connect to our sibling. And again, this doesn't happen overnight, right? The
Right.
grief is very real. We need to leave space for that and really digest that. But these are different things that we can do for that release of that anger or some of that really intense grief.
I have to share this with you.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting. Valentine's Day is special to me too. It happens to be my birthday.
Come
And it's
on. I
funny how
bet
much,
you.
yeah, you and I have connected so quickly. And this very special day for you is a
Oh,
special day for
wow.
me, right?
Wow. I got chills everywhere. That is
I know it's really
crazy.
something. And I was thinking too, my brother died on January 8th, and we call it his birthday in heaven, right? Like we didn't want it to just be this negative. I mean, it is negative that he's not here, but because we believe so much that he lives in another dimension, it's like it was his beginning there, and so that's how we sort of talk about that too.
So that's okay. So there's two dates. The two dates that people dread are birthdays and the death day, right? That's what we
Right.
like to call it, the death day.
Right.
So talk to me about that. How do you celebrate? What do you do stuff as if it's been, I know that it's been a while now for me. I'm coming up on 10 years, which blows me away. But on those two dates, right? You've got his birthday, and did you do things early on as a family? How
Right. We
did you
used to.
handle that?
So his birthday is June 2nd. And for the first several years, maybe even 5 years, we would go away for the weekend together or go away on a vacation. So we tried to be really intentional that we were still celebrating him and acknowledging him. And we've done that less recently. It's been so long now, but we did that for a while. And I remember his friends used to go on camping trips on his birthday, and they had a big banner with his name on it. And now I think on January 8th, we used to toast him. We got together for dinner with my parents, and we just acknowledge, him and say his name out loud. And we really, you know, in integrating this idea that some of our family is here and some of our family is in heaven, like, my children and even my husband never got to meet him. And
Mm.
so, but we've worked really hard to, Uncle Michael is a name that they use. And they've been raised with this idea that some of our families here and some of our families there. And, over time we've lost grandparents and aunts and uncles. And I think my kids have been more exposed to death than most people are. But that's how we integrated my brother, is by acknowledging him and having pictures around and stories about him and talking about him. And you know.
And that's the really important piece. It's the integration piece.
Mhm.
Once you move through the deep grief that
Mhm.
can take a while, can take a
Mhm.
while. That first
Mhm.
year, I call it coasting because you're just trying to get through it and there's a million
Right.
things going on and you're numb. And that second year, and this is interesting too, that the second year can actually be harder in some ways than the first, because that's
Mhm.
really when you start to it becomes more real. Now, this is happening to those of us grieving, but on the outside world, it's like, wow, a year has passed, the four
Right.
seasons, and you're
Right.
doing great, and you could be doing anything but great. And it could also force you into deeper hiding, right? More mask that everything is okay because
Right.
somehow you think that it should be. I want all of my listeners to hear this, that there are people who don't even seek counseling until after that first year. As I said earlier, there's delayed grief where you may not get, it may not hit you in some ways for a while, and it can be very confusing. All of
Mhm.
these things are just different experiences that people have. But
Mhm.
what Don and I have been talking about in terms of the way you think about birthdays and the date of death, you can do whatever you want. You can make them into whatever you want. They don't have to be a day that you just loathe for the
Mhm.
rest of your life, right? You can really shift that energy.
Mhm.
I'm interested. I know that God, I can't even believe that 45 minutes is almost up. I want to ask you about your role with your parents. So, because you were a therapist, right? And it was you and your sister. You were the oldest. Did you say you were the oldest,
Mhm.
right?
Oldest, yeah.
The oldest. So, you said you went back and forth, you know, which I'm guessing during that first year. What was that like for you? When did things in providing that support to parents? Because I think the other misnomer out there is that it's very difficult for us. We stuff our grief, we swallow it, right? Because we need to be strong for our parents. What did that look like for you with your parents, that support? How long did it last? When did you feel like, because we almost lose our parents for a little while, right? We're supporting them, so tell us about that
Yeah.
experience.
I mean, I think my experience maybe is more extreme than other people's because I've never heard anyone describe it. I mean, I think my mom might have cried every day for 5 years, actually, which is a long time. And, so it was a lot of me reassuring her and listening and empathizing and being available and helping her get into therapy, which she did, which I was glad about. So it was just a lot. I don't know. I know we're almost out of time, but the other thing I feel like I need to mention too that was helpful to us as a family is we did go to a medium, and that was just a part of our grief journey. It felt like it helped us, you know, really get validation that my brother still knew what was going on in our lives, that he was okay where he was, that this was meant to be. There was nothing my parents could have done. There's nothing anyone could have done. He was only going to have 22 years here. It was always the plan. And, we went a number of times. They went a lot for a while, and it just sort of helped. And they'd go around his birthday and the holidays like twice a year for a while. And it just sort of helped us get through, I guess, for the first several years, which is just so hard until you somehow learn to live again in a different way. And so that was a part for us. And then I ended up having my daughter, in 2007, so 3 years later. And then that became a new sort of love and
Yes,
something new to focus on. And that was helpful, actually, for my mom, for all of us. But we all had something to hold and cuddle and love, and that became helpful. And so, there was just so many different things that helped the grief shift and bring more light back in.
I love that. And you know how I feel about mediumship, and been working on my own gifts around that too. And I've been going to mediums since I was 15 because I lost my father when I was 10 months old. So I feel like my whole life since I was little has always prepared me in some way because I've been into the afterlife. I mean, literally for as early as I can remember reading books, wondering what heaven was, the whole thing. And of course, we're Catholic, and that was always about heaven and hell. So I was always intrigued, and I always wanted to know, where is this father, right? I mean, I have a dad that raised me, and I was adopted when I was 2. I love dearly, but to know about this father of mine that died when I was 10 months old was
Oh,
always like, what does that mean? Where do they go? Like,
right.
and you have all of these questions, and you go to gifted mediums, and it's life changing, but not everybody believes in that, right? And so,
Mhm.
but for those people who do, I can't count how many times I've gone to mediums because I've just always been, I love the idea of learning how we all have the gift to communicate with the other
Wow.
side. We get it through signs, we get
Right.
it, right? We get
Right.
it through thoughts sometimes. And as that grief becomes less dense, people want to believe in signs. They are true. This is how they communicate with us on the other
Mhm.
side, you know.
Right.
And I
And I
and
did a lot of that. I read like every book after losing Michael, like on afterlife theories and like signs and what to look for, I felt like I needed to learn the language that he was communicating through,
Yes.
right? The energy of language of energy and all of that. And so, right, and read books about for mediums and other people who've lost people, like all of that was really helpful too, to figure it out.
And something that some people might not understand is they have to learn how to communicate with us too, right? I mean,
Mm,
some of the younger new souls, I mean, so we're all learning, but trust when you ask for a sign and you receive it,
hmm
trust that
hmm
that is a sign. And sometimes when we're in deep grief, because the energy is so dense, we miss those signs, right?
Right.
And we don't always get what I've had people say, well, how come I haven't had a visit in a dream? It's not the same for all of us. You
hmm
know, I've never had my brother visit me in a dream, and I'm okay
hmm
with that. He has communicated with me with a lot in a lot of different ways. Let
Right.
me, I've got two questions I always end with. This conversation seems to have just flown by. Often after we lose somebody, our idea of what self-love means changes. A lot of things change. You can't really look at the world in the same way, I think, when we have a significant loss that hits us in our life, like something like this. And how is your idea of self-love, or has it changed? And if so, how?
I guess I think of self-love is accepting all the parts of us. The parts maybe we don't like, right? The shadow side, we would call it in psychology. And and being okay with that, right? Really being okay with this is who I am, right? And that's what I actually like about after 40. I mean, aging gets such a bad rap, but the coolest thing that happens as you get older is you're just like, this is who I am.
Right.
Take it or leave it, world. Like this is, you know, and and accepting that I know. I mean, for me, it's amazing. Like my skills are very specific. Like I'm so bad at so many things, mechanics and cooking and baking and none of that. I'm not good at that stuff at all. But I'm a really relational person and I've built a life and a career around relationships. And so I feel like self-love is knowing what you need and want, accepting the parts of you that maybe you don't always love and having room for that too. You know, having boundaries to protect yourself, right? And keeping yourself on the radar, which is really hard. I think for women, we're not often given the message that you should do that. The message is you should keep doing for others all the time. And so knowing what do I need and how am I doing and how do I make that happen and giving yourself a sense of permission. It's okay to have boundaries and all of that to me feels like self-love, making time for yourself, but even knowing what do I even need and want? And not just thinking about what everybody else needs and wants all the time.
Yeah.
So
And how true is that when we're grieving? You know, we really
yeah.
get to know ourselves in a much deeper way if
Mhm.
we allow the space and time to be with our feelings.
And I have to say, and maybe we end this too, that I feel like not all the change is bad. Some of it's positive. I will tell you what I learned was not to take time in relationships for granted.
Yeah.
We never know how much time we have with people. All we know is we all have, a timetable. Like we don't actually know how much time, you know, and I really prioritize my relationships. I think I parent differently because of that. I'm really intentional. What do I want from this life? What do I want for my children? And I think that sometimes when people haven't gone through significant loss, they don't look through that lens as much and they operate a little differently. And I think what I see even with my clients who've gone through significant loss, there's clarity on what's
Yeah.
important and they live differently because of that. And
Yeah.
that's really powerful. And that's a gift you take
It's a,
with you for the rest of your life.
it is such a gift. It is. Yes, I completely agree. And that's what I mean. We can only know what matters to us if if we leave room to feel how we feel about our experiences and the people that we're with, right? And grief does that. Grief can get you, it's a very, if we allow it, that's the title of this, right? Rock your shine after you've been cracked wide open, because when we've been cracked wide open, and you know this too, people who've gone through intense trauma, you can really get to know who you are in a much deeper way and what really matters to you, you
Mhm.
know?
Absolutely.
And my other question is, I used to say finish the sentence hope is, but I switched it to faith, not for a religious connotation, but faith feels like a deeper knowing than hope. And what does faith mean to you?
Maybe that there's more going on than we get to know, and we
Mm,
just have to trust. And I
mm.
want to know, so don't get me wrong.
Me
And,
too.
and I, my deal I make sort of with faith, if you will, is okay, I don't get to know now, but when I get to the other side, I want all the answers. Like, I want you to, like, okay, make it connect all the dots for me now, right? All the mystery and question in life, I want the answers to. But for now, we don't get to know. We have to feel our way through in a lot of cases. We have to trust those gut feelings, those
Yes,
pulls, and we have to trust the process, and we have to align ourselves or be around people that help us with things that we don't know how to do, right? That help guide us. And I guess that's what faith means to me.
I love that. That is really beautiful. Is there anything that you would like to say to my listeners that I haven't asked?
Oh my goodness. I guess I always think of encouraging people to not do this alone. It's easy to feel alone in grief, especially around sibling loss, but to find a way, some people call it grief buddy or a therapist or maybe a group, and it's hard to find sibling groups. I haven't found any where
I
I
don't
live.
even know. I ran bereavement groups at the Center for Grieving Children, and I don't know of any groups specific to
Right,
sibling loss. I know Compassionate Friends now, they have different chapters and they have people running sibling whatever, but yeah, sibling loss groups are very challenging to find.
right. I know we definitely need more of them.
Hmm.
Or again, even if it's that people go to, those fundraising events where you're with other people who've lost
Yeah,
someone in a similar way, to try to plug into things because this is too hard to do alone.
and we don't have to do it alone.
Right.
We really don't. I want to
Right.
thank you so deeply for coming and sharing just sharing yourself and your experience and your analogy. I love your car. I use it now. Thank you very much. I love your car analogy.
The car
Um,
metaphor.
the car metaphor is really it's pretty poignant. I want to thank all my listeners. I love you guys, and even though this podcast is going to be transitioning, I hope that what we're transitioning to you will also enjoy. So I love you all. Thank you for your time, and I hope you're going to take something from this conversation that will help you on your own journey.
Thank
Uh,
you so much for having me.
Thank you.